Have you ever poured your entire soul into something, not for praise or for glory, but simply because it needed to be done, because you loved it, and because the person you loved most in the world had built it? Have you ever done that, only to have the people who should have been your greatest allies try to use your own hard work to destroy you? They think because you're quiet, you're weak. They think because you serve, you can't lead. They think they can take everything from you and you'll just stand there and let them. That's what they thought about me. And this is the story of how I proved them wrong. If you've ever felt overlooked, underestimated, or betrayed by the very people who were supposed to protect you, then stick around, because you're going to want to hear how this ends. My name is Nora, and for the last 3 years, my life had been a quiet hum of numbers, projections, and code. I was the chief operating officer of
Indivaco.
a tech company my father Richard had founded in our garage 2 decades ago. But my title was a polite fiction. In reality, I was the engine, the rudder, and the bilge pump, all rolled into one. I was the silent, unseen force keeping the ship afloat ever since my father's health began its slow, cruel decline. His mind, once a brilliant labyrinth of innovation and strategy, was now clouded by a progressive neurological condition that left him lucid one moment and lost the next. He was still the face of the company, the chairman of the board, but the day-to-day, the brutal, thankless work of keeping the dream alive, that was all me. And I never complained. I did it because Innovatech wasn't just a business to me. It was a living archive of my father's brilliance. It was the smell of soldering irons and late-night pizza from my childhood. It was every sacrifice he'd made after my mother passed away, pouring his grief and his genius into building a legacy for us. For me, my name was on the patent for our first breakout software, right under his. I was 10 years old when I helped him debug the initial code. This company was in my blood. But blood, as I would soon learn, gets diluted. My stepmother, Diane, had entered our lives about 10 years ago. She was a whirlwind of social grace, expensive perfume, and perfectly curated opinions. She'd met my father at a charity gala, and he, lonely and still grieving in his own quiet way, had been charmed by her radiance. At first, she was wonderful to me. She called me her brilliant bonus daughter and praised my dedication to the company. But her interest wasn't in the company's soul, it was in its balance sheet. She saw Innovatech not as a legacy of innovation, but as a brand, a platform, a source of funding for her lavish lifestyle, and more importantly, for her son, Kyle, my stepbrother. If I was the quiet engine of Innovatech, Kyle was the blaring, useless horn. Diane had convinced my father to give him a job shortly after they were married. He was given the title of Vice President of Business Development, a role so nebulous and ill-defined that his main function seemed to be attending conferences in warm climates and expensing extravagant dinners. He had his father's charming smile, but none of his work ethic. He saw Innovatech as his birthright, a kingdom he was destined to rule, despite having no idea how to even read the maps. The four of us, my ailing father, my ambitious stepmother, my incompetent stepbrother, and me, were the board. My father held the majority shares, but Diane had been granted power of attorney as his health worsened, a decision that had felt like a small necessary sadness at the time, but was now revealing itself to be a catastrophic mistake. Kyle held a small percentage of shares his mother had gifted him. I held the shares my father had given me years ago, a significant block, but not a controlling one. The final member was Arthur Pendleton, my father's oldest friend, and the company's first investor, a man who had been gently but systematically pushed to the margins by Diane's sharp-elbowed ambition. The inciting incident didn't come with a bang. It came, as so many modern betrayals do, in an email. It was a Tuesday evening. I was at the office, as usual long after everyone else had gone home. I was finalizing the quarterly performance review for our big board meeting on Friday. The numbers weren't great. We'd had a challenging quarter, a confluence of market headwinds and a delayed product launch. It was a temporary dip, a problem I already had a 6-point plan to correct, but on paper, it looked grim. I had just finished the last slide of the presentation when the notification pinged. It was from Diane's assistant. Subject: Final agenda for Q3 board meeting. I opened it casually, expecting the usual boilerplate. My eyes scanned the list: call to order, approval of minutes, my own quarterly performance review, and then I saw it. The last item, added by the chairwoman, Diane. Item 6, leadership transition. My blood didn't just run cold, it felt like it evaporated. My lungs seized. The hum of the server room next to my office, a sound that had been the soundtrack to my life, suddenly sounded like a funeral dirge. Leadership transition. There was no ambiguity in those two words. It wasn't leadership discussion, it wasn't future strategy, it was transition, a statement of intent, an executioner's pronouncement, and the placement. It was listed after my presentation. The sequence was chillingly clear. They were going to let me stand up there and present my data, the grim-looking data that I had painstakingly compiled. They would listen with feigned concern as I outlined the challenges. Then they would use my own honesty, my own meticulous work, as the weapon to cut my throat. They would twist my transparency into an admission of failure. Diane would call for a vote of no confidence in my leadership, citing the very numbers I had just shown them. She would argue that in light of my father's condition, the company needed a bold new vision, and she, using my father's voting power, along with her own and Kyle's, would install her son as CEO. They thought I was just a number cruncher, the quiet, dutiful daughter who would organize the data for her own demise, the girl who was too timid, too buried in spreadsheets, to ever fight back. They saw me as a function, not a person, a cog in a machine they were about to hijack. They were standing there, holding a knife they expected me to sharpen for them. What they didn't realize, what they couldn't possibly comprehend, was that I wasn't just presenting data, I was setting a trap, and the final brutal item on their agenda was about to become the very first, and only, item on mine. The first wave that hit me wasn't anger. It was a deep, hollow kind of grief. I just sat there in the pale blue light of my monitor, the damning agenda glowing in the dark, and felt the floor drop out from under my world. The betrayal was so profound, so breathtakingly cold, it was almost elegant in its cruelty. To use my work, my diligence, my loyalty against me, it was a special kind of evil. I leaned forward and rested my forehead on the cool surface of my desk. The silence of the empty building pressed in on me. For a moment, I just wanted to disappear, to pack a bag, walk away from the whole toxic mess, and let them have the company, let them run it into the ground, which I knew, with absolute certainty, they would. But then the memories started to surface, unbidden, like ghosts rising from a sunken ship. First, the good ones. I was 12, and Dad had brought home a prototype of our first major hardware product. It was a clunky, oversized thing, but to me, it was magic. We stayed up all night in the garage, eating cold pizza and drinking soda, while he taught me how to read a circuit diagram. He never treated me like a child, he treated me like a partner. You see, Nora Bean, he'd said, his eyes sparkling with that unique fire he had. People think innovation is about one big, brilliant idea. It's not. It's about 1,000 tiny, thankless fixes. It's about caring enough to find every last bug. He had looked at me with such pride. You've got the heart for it, you care about the details. His words, once a source of immense pride, now felt like a curse. My dedication to the details was the very thing they were using to paint me as small-minded, as a glorified accountant who couldn't see the big picture. Then came the other ghosts. The memory of Dad introducing me to Diane for the first time. It was at a restaurant that was far too fancy, all starched linen and hushed whispers. Diane had been charming, asking me all about my computer science degree at Stanford. "Richard is so proud of you," she'd said, her hand resting on his. "It's wonderful that you take such an interest in his little hobby." His little hobby. The words had landed like a tiny shard of glass in my ear. Innovatech was already a multi-million-dollar company at that point, a leader in its niche. But to her it was just a quaint pastime for the man who was about to upgrade her entire life. It was the first red flag, a tiny pennant I had chosen to ignore, out of a desperate desire for my grieving father to be happy again. And then, the memories of Kyle, the golden child personified. I remembered the day, about a year into Diane's reign, when a massive server crash took down our biggest client's entire network. It was chaos. Phones were ringing off the hook, our support lines were melting down. I traced the problem back to a single command line, an unauthorized protocol change that had bypassed all our firewalls. It was Kyle. He had been trying to streamline a data backup process for his business development team to impress a girl he was dating in marketing. He hadn't asked, he hadn't checked, he just did it. The damage was catastrophic. We were looking at a 7-figure lawsuit and the loss of a client that represented 20% of our annual revenue. I didn't sleep for 3 days. I lived on coffee and the stale donuts from the break room. I personally flew to the client's headquarters in Chicago, got on my knees, and begged for a chance to make it right. I worked with their IT team around the clock, rebuilding their database from our off-site backups, writing custom patches on the fly. On the 3rd day I fixed it. I saved the account. I flew home, exhausted but triumphant, expecting, I don't know what I was expecting, a thank you, acknowledgement. I walked into the Sunday family dinner my father still insisted on. Diane was holding court at the head of the table, a glass of expensive red wine in her hand. She was telling a story about Kyle, and so, she said, beaming at him, while it was a terribly stressful situation, Richard and I feel that Kyle learned such a valuable lesson in corporate responsibility. It was a real trial by fire for him, and were just so proud of how he handled the pressure. I stopped dead in the doorway, handled the pressure. He had spent the last 3 days working from home, which meant ignoring my calls and playing video games. I had handled the pressure. I had handled the consequences. I looked at my father, hoping to see a flicker of dissent, of fairness, but he just looked tired. He patted my arm as I sat down. "You did good work, Nora," he mumbled, his focus already drifting. "Diane's right though, it's good for the boy to get his hands dirty." I felt something inside me crack that day. The injustice was so blatant, so utterly shameless, that I couldn't even form the words to protest. I just ate my paella, the famous paella Diane always made to show off her supposed sophistication, and let the resentment simmer in my stomach. It was one of 100 such incidents. The time Kyle blew half the marketing budget on a disastrous ad campaign featuring a D-list celebrity, and I had to reallocate R&D funds to cover the shortfall. The time he promised a client a feature that was technologically impossible, and I had to personally call their CTO and walk back the promise, making our entire company look foolish. Every time, I was the janitor, cleaning up his messes. And every time, Diane would spin it as a learning experience for her precious boy, while my own achievements, the steady growth I was engineering, the patents I was filing, went completely unnoticed. It wasn't about revenge then, it was about survival. It was about protecting my father's life's work from the very people who were supposed to be its guardians. My passivity, my willingness to endure it all, wasn't weakness. It was a calculated strategy, born of love. I knew my father's health was fragile. A massive family blow-up, a confrontation, would have put an immense strain on him. Diane knew this, and she used it as a shield. "We mustn't upset your father, Nora," she'd say, her voice dripping with false concern, whenever I even hinted at Kyle's incompetence. So I stayed quiet. I endured. I told myself I was doing it for him. I was holding the line until he got better.
Both.
A hope that was fading with each passing month. I was the family scapegoat, the ever-reliable, overlooked provider, and I had accepted the role because I thought it was the only way to protect what was truly important. Lifting my head from the desk, I stared at the agenda on the screen. The fog of grief began to dissipate, replaced by a cold, clear light. The years of quiet resentment, of swallowed injustices, of thankless work, all coalesced into a single hard point of clarity. They weren't just trying to take my job, they were trying to erase me, to take my father's legacy, the company I had helped build, the very essence of my life's work, and hand it to a buffoon as a shiny new toy. They were counting on my love for my father to keep me silent. They were counting on my quiet nature to make me compliant. And then my phone buzzed on the desk. A text from Diane. "Nora, darling, I saw the final agenda went out. I know the transitions item might look a bit startling, but please don't worry. Kyle and I, and your father, we just want what's best for the company he built. It needs a strong, decisive voice right now, a real leader for the future. We'll make this as painless as possible for you. We'll find a nice consulting role for you, something less stressful. We're still family. After all, the condescension, the breathtaking poisonous condescension, asterisk painless for me, he nice consulting role, the dam of my restraint, built over years of careful, loving patience, didn't just crack, it exploded. A wave of fury, so pure and so cold it felt like ice water in my veins, washed away every last shred of doubt and despair.
This.
Softer is one of death. Softer is. They thought this was a family matter. They thought wrong. This was business. I stood up, my back straight. I walked over to the window and looked out at the glittering lights of Seattle. They had mistaken my silence for submission. They had mistaken my diligence for a lack of ambition. They had mistaken my love for my father as a chain they could use to bind me. And they had just handed me the key to my own cage. The plan that began to form in my mind was not born of panic or anger. It was born of the same meticulous, detail-oriented logic they so casually dismissed. They wanted to use my data to show weakness. Fine, I would use it to show a value they were too blind to see. It wasn't about revenge, not really. But as I stood there, watching the city breathe below me, a small cold smile touched my lips for the first time in a very long time. Okay, maybe it was a little bit about revenge. The first call I made wasn't to a lawyer or a headhunter, it was to Arthur Pendleton. Arthur had been my father's partner in crime since they were college roommates. He was a tweed-wearing, pipe-smoking anachronism in the fast-paced tech world, but his mind was as sharp as a tack, and his loyalty to my father was absolute. Diane had skillfully maneuvered him into a largely ceremonial role on the board, treating him like a doddering old relic, but I knew better. Arthur saw everything. I met him the next morning at a small, out-of-the-way coffee shop, the kind with worn-out armchairs and the smell of old books. I didn't waste any time. I slid a copy of the board meeting agenda across the table. He put on his reading glasses, his eyes scanning the page. When he got to item 6, he let out a low whistle. He took off his glasses and looked at me, his expression a mixture of anger and sadness. "So the palace coup is finally happening," he said, his voice a low rumble. I had a feeling Diane was orchestrating something. She's been canvassing the other 2 independent board members, whispering poison in their ears for months. "What kind of poison?" I asked, my voice tight. "The usual," he sighed, stirring his coffee. "That you're a brilliant technician, Nora, but not a leader. That you're too cautious, too in the weeds to navigate the company through rough waters. That you lack vision. She's been painting you as the dutiful daughter who's in over her head, a glorified accountant, while positioning Kyle as the charismatic rainmaker who can charm investors and rally the troops." My stomach churned. It was my own private nightmare, verbalized. "And they're buying it. They're nervous," Arthur admitted. "The numbers this quarter are soft, and Diane is a very convincing snake. She plays on their fear. She makes it sound like keeping you in charge is the risky move, and that Kyle, with her and your father's backing, is the safe bet." He leaned forward, his eyes locking on mine. "She's wrong, of course. Kyle couldn't lead a pack of lemmings off a cliff, but fear makes people stupid. So the question is, what are you going to do about it, my dear? Are you going to let them take your father's legacy?" I took a deep breath. "No," I said, and the word felt solid, real. "I'm not. In fact, I'm going to give them exactly what they want. A transition." Arthur raised an eyebrow. "They want to use my quarterly report to prove the company is weak," I explained, my mind racing, the plan crystallizing as I spoke. "They're right, in a way. The report shows a temporary vulnerability. It shows a dip in revenue, a stalled product pipeline, increased market pressure. What they see as weakness, someone else might see as an opportunity, a discount." A slow smile spread across Arthur's face. "A hostile takeover," he whispered, the words hanging in the air like smoke. "Not hostile," I corrected him. "Brokered, by me." The beautiful fatal flaw in their plan was their complete ignorance of how the company actually worked. They saw a line on a graph go down and thought, "Bad." I saw that same line and understood the intricate web of reasons behind it. I knew our pipeline wasn't stalled because of a lack of ideas. It was stalled because I had to divert R&D resources to clean up another one of Kyle's multi-million-dollar fiascos. I knew our market share had dipped not because our product was inferior, but because our biggest competitor, Cygnus Dynamics, had just spent a fortune on a marketing blitz we couldn't afford to match. And I knew our most valuable asset wasn't our current product line. It was a portfolio of 3 obscure patents I had filed 2 years ago. They were for a predictive data compression algorithm that I had developed in my spare time. At the time, they were a solution to a problem that didn't quite exist yet. But now, with the advent of 5G and the explosion of the Internet of Things, that algorithm was the key. The company that held those patents would dominate the next decade of data transfer. Cygnus Dynamics had the infrastructure, the capital, the market presence. We had the key, and they didn't know it. But I did. "Elias Vance," I said, naming the notoriously aggressive CEO of Cygnus. "He wants to corner the market. He's been trying to develop a compression algorithm of his own for years, and he's failed. I've read the industry reports. He needs our patents." "Vance is a shark, Nora," Arthur warned. "If you get in the water with him, he'll smell blood." "I'm counting on it," I replied. "But the blood he's going to smell isn't mine, it's the company's. I'm going to show him the same presentation I'm giving the board. I'm going to show him the weakness, and then I'm going to show him the patents. I'm going to offer him a once-in-a-lifetime chance to buy his biggest obstacle at a perceived discount, just before it launches the very technology that would make it invincible." This was where the plausibility layer had to be perfect. I couldn't just call Elias Vance. I needed to be firewalled. Arthur, bless his old-school heart, knew a guy. A corporate mergers and acquisitions lawyer named Marcus Thorne, a man with a reputation for being discreet, brilliant, and utterly ruthless. Arthur made the introduction. My first meeting with Marcus was in a sterile glass-walled office that overlooked Puget Sound. He was a tall, lean man with eyes that seemed to miss nothing. I laid out the entire situation, the company, my father's health, Diane and Kyle, the board meeting, the patents. I didn't editorialize. I just gave him the facts. He listened without interruption, his fingers steepled. When I finished, he was silent for a full minute. "This is audacious," he finally said, a glimmer of something that might have been admiration in his eyes, "and legally complex. You're an officer of the company, and you'd be brokering its sale without the board's knowledge. That's a minefield of fiduciary duty." "My fiduciary duty," I countered. my voice steady, is to protect the shareholders and the legacy of this company. My stepmother and stepbrother are about to install a grossly incompetent CEO which will crater the company's value within a year. Their plan is a clear violation of their own fiduciary duty. I am presenting an alternative that will maximize shareholder value beyond their wildest dreams. It's the most responsible thing I can do. Marcus nodded slowly. All right, I'm in, but we do this my way. You will have no direct contact with Cygnus until the final stage. I will make the approach through back channels, on behalf of an unnamed principal from a competitor. We'll use the vulnerability as the bait. This will all be done under the tightest possible NDA. If Diane gets a whisper of this before that board meeting, the whole thing is dead, and you'll be out on the street. The next few days were a blur of clandestine activity. I set up a new encrypted laptop and a burner phone. I sent Marcus a firewalled data packet containing the quarterly report and a detailed analysis of the patent portfolio's potential valuation. He worked his magic. 2 days later, he called me on the burner. Vance is interested, he said, his voice flat, betraying no emotion. He's skeptical. He thinks it's a trick, but he's intrigued enough to meet. He wants to meet the unnamed principal. He wants to look you in the eye. The meeting was set for the following evening, the night before the board meeting, at a quiet, dark-paneled bar in a boutique hotel in a different part of the city. Marcus and I arrived first. My heart was pounding so hard I could feel it in my teeth. This was the point of no return. Elias Vance was exactly as I had imagined. He was sharp, impeccably dressed, with a predator's stillness. He didn't waste time on pleasantries. He sat down, nodded at Marcus, and then fixed his gaze on me. I don't like games, he said, his voice a low growl. Your lawyer says you have something for me. Show me. For a moment I almost faltered. The sheer force of his personality was overwhelming. But then I thought of Diane's smirking face, of Kyle's unearned confidence, of my father's legacy being turned into a plaything. The ice returned to my veins. I opened my briefcase and pulled out a single thin folder. It wasn't a flashy presentation, it was just the data, the same slides I was preparing for my own execution. This is our quarterly report, I said, my voice much calmer than I felt. It's not good. Our revenue is down 7%. Our flagship product is underperforming. Our primary competitor, you, is eating our lunch in the consumer market. Vance looked at the numbers, a flicker of a triumphant smile on his lips. So you're failing, he said. Why should I buy a failing company? Because you're looking at the wrong battlefield, I replied. I slid a second folder across the table. These are 3 patents Innovatech currently holds. My projections show that the technology they represent will render the current consumer market obsolete within 18 months. Your entire infrastructure, the one you've spent billions to build, will be playing catch-up to a technology we perfected 2 years ago. I had him. I could see it in the way his eyes narrowed, the way his hand, which had been resting casually on the table, tightened into a fist. He read the technical summary, his expression shifting from arrogance to intense, focused concentration. He knew exactly what he was looking at. This data, he said, his voice now a strained whisper. How do I know it's real? You don't, I said, but your engineers will. You have 24 hours to do your due diligence. My lawyer has a data room on standby for your team, but the offer to even look at it is only good until we leave this bar. It was a gamble, a huge one, but I was betting on his ego, on his rapacious need to win. He stared at me for a long, silent moment. I met his gaze without flinching. This wasn't timid Nora, the girl who fixed other people's problems. This was Richard's daughter. This was the architect of his greatest technological triumph. They saw a spreadsheet. He was finally seeing the strategist. All right, he said, pushing the folder back towards me. Set it up. My team will be in touch with your lawyer within the hour. He stood to leave but paused. One more thing. Why are you doing this? This is the ultimate betrayal of your own company. I looked him straight in the eye. No, I said. This is the ultimate salvation. You're not just buying a company, Mr. Vance. You're buying it from people who don't deserve to own it. He gave a short, sharp nod, a look of grudging respect on his face, and then he was gone. Marcus and I sat in silence for a moment. Then he let out a long, slow breath. Well, he said, allowing himself a small, thin smile. The shark is in the water. The final 24 hours before the board meeting were the strangest of my life. I went into the office the next day and behaved as if nothing had happened. I was a ghost at the feast, the living embodiment of a secret that could shatter the entire world I was moving through. I responded to emails. I signed purchase orders. I walked through the halls, exchanging pleasantries with people whose jobs I was secretly fighting to save. All the while, my burner phone was buzzing with encrypted updates from Marcus. Vance's team was in the data room. They were tearing my algorithm apart, verifying everything. They were working as frantically as I was pretending to be calm. The change in Diane and Kyle was palpable. My silence, my serene, maddening calm, was getting under their skin. They had expected tears, arguments, pleading. My quiet compliance was, to them, a sign of surrender. But as the day wore on, their smug confidence began to curdle into a kind of nervous anxiety. They couldn't read me, and it was driving them insane. Kyle was the first to crack. He cornered me by the coffee machine, trying for a tone of brotherly concern that came off as utterly reptilian. Hey, Nora, look, I know tomorrow is going to be tough, but this is for the best, you know. The company needs new energy, a fresh face, no hard feelings, right? I just looked at him, my expression placid. I'm focused on delivering a comprehensive and accurate report to the board, Kyle. That's my only priority. He blinked, thrown off by my lack of emotion. Right, yeah, the report. Say, could you, send me the slides? I just want to be prepared, to make sure we're all on the same page. The presentation will be delivered at the meeting, as is standard practice, I said, turning to walk away. I'm sure you'll find it very informative. His face flushed with frustration. He was used to me fixing things for him, making things easy. My refusal to play my assigned part was a glitch in his programming. A few hours later, Diane called me into her office. It was a space I'd always hated, all white leather and chrome, with abstract art on the walls that cost more than my car. It was a sterile transactional space, just like her. She didn't ask me to sit. Nora, she began, her voice tight with forced patience. I need to see the presentation, now. It is completely inappropriate for you to withhold this information from the chairwoman before a board meeting. With all due respect, Diane, I said, my voice level, the presentation is not finished. I am making final adjustments to ensure the data is as up to the minute as possible. It will be ready for the meeting at 10 a.m. tomorrow. It was a lie, of course. The presentation had been finished for days, but it was a lie she couldn't challenge without revealing her hand, without admitting she needed my work to stage her coup. Her perfectly manicured nails tapped an impatient rhythm on her glass desk. Her smile was a thin, brittle line. You are being emotional, Nora, and you're being difficult. This is not a game. We are trying to protect your father's legacy. Don't make this harder than it needs to be. There it is again, I thought, my father's legacy. The phrase they used as a shield for their naked greed. I just stood there, my hands clasped behind my back, and met her gaze. I didn't argue, I didn't defend myself. I just let the silence hang in the air, a weapon she didn't know how to fight. Her frustration was a visible aura around her. She had a script for a tearful, hysterical Nora. She had a script for a pleading, defeated Nora. She had no script for this calm, unreadable stranger standing in her office. She dismissed me with a flick of her wrist, her jaw clenched. As I walked back to my office, I saw them, huddled together in a glass-walled conference room. Kyle was pacing, gesticulating wildly. Diane was on her phone, her face a mask of fury. They thought their ambush was being thwarted by my stubbornness. They had no idea that their neat little plan was already obsolete, a historical footnote in a war they didn't even know had started. They were still planning their first move, while my pieces were already closing in on their king. That evening, I didn't go home. I stayed in my office, watching the city lights come on. Around 9 p.m., the burner phone buzzed. It was Marcus. He's in, was all he said. My knees felt weak with relief. I sank into my chair. Vance has signed the letter of intent, Marcus continued. It's an all-cash offer. The premium is 40% above current market value. It's a ridiculously generous offer. He wants this, Nora. He wants it bad. What are the conditions? I asked, my voice hoarse. Standard stuff. Due diligence confirmed everything. The deal is contingent on a single vote of approval by your board of directors, and the offer is time-sensitive. It expires tomorrow at noon. You have one shot at this. I took a deep breath. Thank you, Marcus, for everything. Don't thank me yet, he said, a rare hint of warmth in his voice. Go get him, kid. I spent the rest of the night not preparing my old presentation, but assembling new ones. 5 identical, pristine, leather-bound folders. Inside each one was not a story of failure, but a story of triumph, a story of a massive payday. I printed out the letter of intent from Cygnus Dynamics, the legal weight of it feeling like a slab of gold in my hands. Just before midnight, Arthur called my office line. How are you holding up? He asked. I'm ready, I said. Good, he replied, because the natives are restless. Diane called me an hour ago. She tried to get me to formally demand you release the slides, said you were being dangerously unpredictable. The irony is so thick you could use it as a paperweight. She spooked Nora. Your silence has done more to terrify them than any argument could have. That was the point, I said. Are you still with me, Arthur? My dear, he chuckled. A dry, crackling sound. I will be sitting right beside you, and when you make your move, I will be the first one to second the motion. It's going to be a hell of a show. We hung up. I looked at the 5 folders sitting on my desk. They looked like weapons. They were. My father taught me that innovation was about 1,000 tiny thankless fixes, but he also taught me that sometimes, the best fix isn't a fix at all. It's a complete system reboot. And the system was about to be rebooted, whether they liked it or not. The boardroom at Innovate was on the top floor, a glass-encased space with a panoramic view of the Seattle skyline. It was designed to project power and vision. That morning, it just felt like a cage. The air was thick with a tension so heavy you could taste it, like ozone before a lightning strike. The long, polished mahogany table reflected our distorted faces like a dark mirror. At the head of the table, my father's chair sat empty. It was a gaping wound in the room, a symbol of the authority that was up for grabs. Diane had taken the seat to its right, a regent positioning herself next to the vacant throne. Kyle sat opposite her, trying to look relaxed and confident, but he was constantly adjusting his tie and fidgeting with a ridiculously oversized watch. He looked like a boy playing dress-up in his father's suit. The 2 independent board members, a venture capitalist named Peterson and a marketing guru named Chen, looked deeply uncomfortable. They avoided my eyes, their faces etched with a kind of pained apology. They were about to betray me, and they at least had the decency to feel bad about it. Arthur sat to my left, a calm, solid presence. He gave my hand a brief, reassuring squeeze under the table. I, for my part, felt an eerie sense of calm. I had slept for 2 hours on the couch in my office, but I felt more awake and alive than I had in years. The fear and anxiety were gone, burned away by the cold fire of my resolve. I was no longer a participant in their drama. I was a director about to call action, on a scene they had no idea was coming. Diane called the meeting to order, her voice smooth as silk. Good morning, everyone. Thank you for being here. First on the agenda, approval of the minutes from the last meeting. She went through the motions with practiced ease, a gracious hostess at a dinner party where the main course was my career. When she was done with the formalities, she turned to me, her expression a perfect mask of sympathetic concern. And now we have the Q3 performance review from our COO, Nora. Nora, thank you, as always, for your diligent and thorough work during what we all know has been a challenging time for the company. The floor is yours. This was it. The moment they'd been waiting for. The moment the lamb was supposed to walk to the slaughter. I didn't move. I didn't open my laptop. I just sat there, my hands resting on the 5 leather-bound folders in front of me. The silence stretched. Kyle cleared his throat, shifting in his seat. Peterson was looking down at his notes. Chen was studying a fleck on the tabletop. Diane's smile tightened by a millimeter. Nora, she prompted. Actually, Diane. Kyle piped up, seizing the opportunity to look decisive. If it's all right, I'd like to say a few words first, to frame the discussion. Diane beamed at him. An excellent idea, Kyle. Please. Kyle stood up, straightening his suit jacket. He held a set of cue cards in his hand. He was about to deliver a speech he and his mother had no doubt rehearsed for weeks. Thank you, Mother. Madam Chairwoman, he began, stumbling already. Members of the board. I've been looking at the numbers Nora has prepared, and while her analysis is as always incredibly detailed, the inescapable conclusion is a sobering one. He began to walk around the table, a parody of a charismatic leader. He started quoting my own data points, twisting them into cudgels. A 7% drop in quarterly revenue, a 12% decline in user engagement, a projected loss for the first time in 5 years. He was using my work, my honesty, as evidence for the prosecution. Each number was a nail he was trying to hammer into my coffin. These are not just numbers on a page, he declared, his voice rising with synthetic passion. They are a warning sign. A sign that Innovate, this great company my stepfather built, has lost its way. It has become too cautious, too slow, too focused on the past. What this company needs now is not a caretaker. It needs a visionary. It needs a bold new direction. It needs a leader who can inspire, who can innovate, who can take us into the future. As he spoke, I didn't look hurt. I didn't look angry. I didn't even look interested. I just watched him, my expression unreadable, and my calm, my complete lack of reaction, was starting to unravel them. It was like they were throwing punches, and I was simply refusing to be there when they landed. The other board members noticed. Their eyes kept flicking from Kyle's desperate, theatrical performance to my quiet, unnerving stillness. The power dynamic in the room was beginning to shift. They had expected a fight or a surrender. My placid boredom was something they hadn't prepared for. Diane could feel it too. Her confident facade was beginning to crack. She kept darting nervous glances in my direction, a flicker of uncertainty in her eyes. The exodus of their confidence had begun. It wasn't a flood, but a slow, steady leak. They had built their entire plan on the foundation of my predictable, emotional reaction, and I was denying them that foundation. Their entire strategy was built on a version of me that no longer existed. Kyle finished his speech with a flourish, landing on a line that was supposed to be his triumphant conclusion. It is with a heavy heart, but a firm conviction in the future of this company, that I must therefore support the motion for a leadership transition. He sat down, looking flushed and pleased with himself, like a child who had just recited a poem perfectly. He looked at his mother for approval. Diane gave him a tight, approving nod, but her eyes were locked on me. "Thank you, Kyle, for your candor and your vision," she said, her voice a little too sharp. "Now, before I call for a vote on the matter of the transition, does anyone else have anything to add?" Her eyes swept the room, daring anyone to speak. They passed over me, dismissing me as a non-entity, a problem already solved. That was her final mistake. I raised my hand. My voice when I spoke was not loud, but it cut through the tension in the room, like a scalpel. "Madam Chairwoman." Every head snapped in my direction. The surprise was so total it was almost comical. Diane stared at me, her mouth slightly agape. She had already written me off. "Yes, Nora," she said, her voice dripping with impatience. "Before we proceed to a vote on your agenda item," I said, my gaze sweeping across the table, meeting each person's eyes, "I would like to exercise my right as a board member and a shareholder to amend the agenda. I have a time-sensitive matter of urgent business that, according to our corporate bylaws, must take precedence over all other items." A wave of shock rippled through the room. Peterson and Chen exchanged wide-eyed glances. Kyle looked utterly confused. Diane's face went from pale to a deep, mottled red. "That is highly irregular, Nora," she hissed, her mask of civility finally slipping. "The agenda is set. We will not be sidetracked by procedural games. I assure you," I said calmly, "this is not a game." Before she could shut me down, Arthur spoke up, his voice a firm, steady baritone. "I second a motion to amend the agenda." Check. According to the company's own bylaws, a motion to amend, once seconded, had to be acknowledged. Diane was trapped by the very rules she was trying to use to her advantage. She had no choice. Her jaw was so tight, I was surprised her teeth didn't crack. "Very well," she bit out. "The floor is yours, Nora. Make it quick." I stood up. I didn't look at my laptop. I didn't look at any notes. I looked directly at Diane and Kyle, a small cold smile playing on my lips. "Thank you, Madam Chairwoman," I began. "You and Kyle have spoken at length about the company's future. You've used my data to paint a picture of weakness and decline. You've argued for a leadership transition to save my father's legacy." I paused, letting the words hang in the air. "And on that point, I find myself in complete agreement with you. A transition is necessary. In fact, it's inevitable." I reached for the 5 leather-bound folders on the table. "Kyle," I said, my voice dangerously soft, "you talked about a sobering conclusion, but you stopped reading the story halfway through. You saw the dip, but you didn't see the reason for the climb on the other side. You were so busy planning your coronation that you failed to properly value the crown jewels." I walked around the table and placed a folder in front of each board member. Peterson, Chen, Arthur, Kyle, and finally Diane. I placed hers on the table, with a soft, definitive thud. "The final item on your agenda," I said, my voice ringing with clarity, "has become the first and only item on mine." They opened the folder. The room went utterly, profoundly silent. The only sound was the soft rustle of paper as they turned the first page. Inside there was no quarterly report. There were no grim projections. There was only the signed, legally binding letter of intent from Elias Vance, CEO of Cygnus Dynamics, offering to acquire 100% of Innovatech in an all-cash deal. I let them absorb it. I watched the color drain from Diane's face. I saw Kyle's jaw go slack, his eyes wide with uncomprehending shock. Peterson and Chen were staring at the paper, as if it were a winning lottery ticket. "As you can see," I continued, my voice now commanding the room, "Cygnus Dynamics has made a rather generous offer. It represents a 40% premium on our current stock price. The deal includes job security for all current Innovatech employees and a significant investment in our R&D department to bring our predictive compression algorithm to market." I let my gaze settle on Diane and Kyle. "The offer is, of course, contingent on immediate and unanimous board approval. It expires today, at noon." I glanced at the clock on the wall, 47 minutes. The new reality began to dawn on them, cold and brutal. I had not come to fight for my job. I had come to sell the entire kingdom out from under them. "So we have a choice to make," I said, returning to my seat. "Option A, You can proceed with your plan. You can hold your vote of no confidence, oust me, and install Kyle as CEO. You can have him lead the company, whose myriad vulnerabilities you so eloquently just broadcasted to the entire board. And you can try to explain to the rest of the shareholders why you turned down an offer that would have made them all fantastically wealthy. I leaned forward. Or option B, you can vote to approve this deal. You can secure my father's legacy by ensuring his technology changes the world, backed by a global powerhouse. And you can all walk away with more money than you could have ever dreamed of leeching from this company over the next decade. Checkmate. Their trap had snapped shut on themselves. Their meticulously planned ambush had become a public execution of their own greed and incompetence. They couldn't fight the deal. To vote against it would be to commit an act of such blatant shareholder destruction that the lawsuits would be legendary. To vote against it would be to admit, in front of everyone, that their plan was never about the company's health. It was about their own power. They had to say yes. They had to vote for my plan. They had to watch me, the quiet number cruncher, the timid little girl, single-handedly orchestrate the single biggest event in the company's history. Diane looked at me, her eyes burning with a hatred so pure it was almost beautiful. She had been so close. She had tasted the victory, and I had turned it to ash in her mouth. Kyle just looked broken, a puppet with its strings cut, staring at the number on the page that represented his personal payout, a number that was simultaneously a king's ransom and the price of his ultimate humiliation. The vote, when Diane finally called it, was a foregone conclusion. Peterson and Chen voted yes with undisguised glee. Arthur's eye was a triumphant boom in the silent room, and then it came to Kyle. He looked at his mother, lost. She gave a tiny, almost imperceptible shake of her head, her face a stone mask. He mumbled yes to the table, and finally Diane. Her yes was a barely audible whisper, the sound of a dying breath. My own eye was clear and strong. The motion passed, unanimously. The aftermath was a whirlwind of lawyers and paperwork. The merger was announced the next day, sending shockwaves through the industry. Innovatech's stock soared. Elias Vance, true to his word, appointed me to lead the transition team, giving me a generous bonus and a senior executive role at Cygnus. He respected strength, and in that boardroom, I had shown him what real strength looked like. Diane and Kyle got their money. They were obscenely rich now, beyond the dreams of avarice. But they lost everything that truly mattered to them. They lost the company, they lost the power. They lost the social standing that came with being at the helm of my father's legacy. They were just two more rich, empty people with nothing to do but count their money. The last I heard, Diane was trying to establish herself as a philanthropist, a title that rang hollow without the Innovatech name to back it up. Kyle had apparently invested a chunk of his fortune in a string of nightclubs, a venture I was sure he would run with his usual Midas touch in reverse. I took care of my father. With the money from the sale, I moved him into the best private care facility in the state, a place with gardens and art therapy, and doctors who were at the top of their field. On his lucid days, I would sit with him, and we would talk about the old days in the garage. I told him I'd sold the company. He just squeezed my hand and smiled. You always did know the right fix, Nora Bean, he'd said. I'm not sure if he fully understood, but he knew I had protected him. He knew I had protected his dream. That was enough for me. Was it what he would have wanted, for me to sell his life's work? I've asked myself that question 1,000 times. In a perfect world, no. In a perfect world, he would be healthy, and we would be running it together. But we don't live in a perfect world. I was faced with a choice: let his legacy be corrupted and destroyed from within by parasites, or set it free, even if it meant letting it go. I saved the soul of the company by selling its body. It was a bittersweet victory, but it was a victory nonetheless. You know, they mistook my quiet diligence for weakness. They saw a caretaker, a functionary, not a kingmaker. They looked at me and saw a spreadsheet, not a person with a breaking point, and that's a mistake a lot of people make. They underestimate the quiet ones, the ones who do the work without demanding the credit. They forget that the person who knows all the details, who understands all the systems, who knows where every single vulnerability lies, that's the person with the real power. They are the ones who know exactly how to change the score. It wasn't about revenge when it started, it was about preservation. But in the end, watching their faces in that boardroom, seeing their whole world of entitlement and arrogance crumble to dust because of a plan they were too self-absorbed to ever see coming, I have to admit, the vindication was pretty sweet. They thought they were writing the end of my story, but they were just a footnote in the beginning of mine. So I want to ask you, have you ever been in a situation where people just completely underestimated you? where they saw your kindness as a weakness to be exploited? Tell me about it in the comments below. I read every single one, and I think we all have stories to share about the moment we decided we were done being the quiet one. And if you enjoyed my story, and you want to hear more stories about people finally getting what they deserve, make sure to hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and turn on notifications so you don't miss a single thing. Thanks for listening.